It's 4 o'clock. I'd like to start on time, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Before I do get started with my talk, huge shout out to the sponsors of that conference. For without the sponsors, we would not all be able to come here and hang out today and see all these awesome people give talks and have community and do all the things we love to do at this conference. That conference. I had to get the joke in. My talk is demystifying deployments as a service. Essentially, what we're going to do in this talk is look at a service like Netlify or Vercel. We're going to break down the service and how it deploys websites out into the public internet. I'm going to show you a demo on, well, we're going to actually go through Agenda. I don't know why I'm doing this now. So we're going to explore how Netlify deploys code. This is kind of the big thing. These concepts and principles really apply to any one of these, what I call deployment as a service providers, which are those that take code that you publish to GitHub and just get them out into the public internet. Things like Heroku, Vercel, tools like that. I'm most familiar with Netlify, so we're going to focus kind of on Netlify here today, but the principles share across. We're going to deconstruct the processes and tools that you can use in order to build something yourself. I have a brief demo of a project that I built and deployed using many of these tools, at least many different tools put together in order to make this happen. And then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and tool suggestions on how you can get started on your own, should you choose to do so. I have a part 2 to the demo, which is completely new to this talk, and we're going to pray and tithe to the demo gods that it actually works here. So this is very exciting. And then finally, I do expect this talk to come in under time, so there's going to be plenty of opportunity for QA and stuff after that. I can answer any questions to the best of my ability. That's me. I am Brian Morrison. I'm a developer educator for a company called Clerk, user management platform. I like teaching developers how to do things because I'm a self-taught developer myself, so being able to spread and share that knowledge is really important to me, and I'm so thankful that I get to do that. Before this, however, I was a full-time engineer. I've held roles such as lead backend dev for a telematics company, building integrations, working on the back end. I've also been a full-stack developer working with React, Vue, AngularJS, not Angular, AngularJS to clarify, for those of you who remember that. Before that even, I was in systems and networking. So I used to rack and stack servers and make them all talk together. I used to manage two data centers across that served 20 warehouses across the US. That is also still a passion of mine. I don't have a picture on here anymore, but I actually have a big iron server sitting in my soon-to-be basement, so that's fun. Husband and father. My wife is chasing my kids around while they're trying to bankrupt all the swag on the booth here, if you've seen them running up and down here today. And then I'm also a gamer. My game of choice is Destiny 2. I fell in love with it about, I'm sorry? I fell in love with the game in 2015. I've been playing it ever since, and it's going to be kind of important to the talk, which you'll see when we get to the demo portion. Who's deployed something using Netlify? Show of hands. Good number of people. Okay, so we're going to catch everybody else up to speed. For those of you who have not deployed using Netlify, here's how the process works. You write some code, as we all do. If you haven't, this is an odd conference for you to show up at, but cool, we welcome you nonetheless. You commit your code up to GitHub, and then Netlify comes along and works some magic. By the way, totally didn't time this for the Deadpool release 2 weekends ago, so this was awesome. I was so happy this fell in line. But Netlify comes along and works some magic on your code, and then all of a sudden, your site is live and people can access it. So, as I said, the big question here, one of 2 big questions here, is how does this magic work? And if I had to sum it up into one word, it would be DevOps. The other working title for this slide would be automation. I like to think of those 2 words to be kind of synonymous, DevOps being the principle that drives the automation to make all of these things happen for us. Let's take a peek inside the black box that is Netlify and how it works. Before I even get started with the rest of this, I would like to say that I've never worked for Netlify. I'm not giving away trade secrets and how they do stuff. A lot of this is just based on my knowledge of the field and just things that I have inferred from logs and processes that I can see happening on their website. So the first step is initialization. Before the days of containers, we use containers now, but before the days of containers, there used to be dedicated servers that had all of your runtimes and things on there so this way it can build the code. Nowadays, all of this stuff can be consolidated into a container. There's one of the great benefits of them being in containers is they're ephemeral. You could spin a container up, have all your stuff set up to build your code, and then everything gets torn back down at the end of the day. This part in Netlify specifically, and all the pictures you see here are actually logs from a website that I've worked on in my own Netlify account. This part of the phase also installs your dependencies. So if you're familiar with the Node ecosystem, JavaScript, npm install gets run here. Next up, we build the site. So we run npm build or npm CI, whichever you prefer, and we get the artifacts that come out the end of it. If you are using serverless functions, that also happens here. So your serverless functions are constructed in such a way that they can actually be executed. Step 3 is to deploy. This step is where we take what are called the artifacts, and the artifacts just being the term we use for all of the stuff that gets spit out of the build process that can actually be run and executed and have something meaningful done with it. So the artifacts are built in the previous step, and they're pushed out into publicly accessible servers in this step. So this way people can access them from the outside world. This is the part where your serverless functions are also deployed out as well. The next thing that also happens here is the files inside of a CDN are replaced. So Netlify has a global CDN around the world. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of a CDN, it is this distributed network of nodes where files are hosted to be geographically close to the people who are accessing them. So let's theoretically say you have an application that is used by people in the United States and people in Europe, and your code is all built and hosted in the US. If you did not have a CDN, people in Europe would have a slower time accessing it because with as much magic as Netlify does solve, it hasn't quite solved the laws of physics. So they would still have to take that trip around over the pond. So by putting files in a CDN, those files then get stored into spots or multiple spots wherever they're stored. So you have your files in the US, you have your files in Europe. So this way, whoever's accessing them will reach the closest version of those files, making the overall system faster. And next up, if you are deploying new serverless functions or new websites, this is where routing update takes place. So this way, the backend system knows how to route things to where they're going to go. Next up, we have cleanup. I mentioned earlier in the build the build phase that containers are nice because you can pull them up, tear them down. Typically, in a cleanup phase of one of these pipelines, this is where those containers would be torn down. However, in this case, Netlify does two pretty interesting things. So they cache the artifacts for rollback if needed. If there is a situation where you build a website and deploy it and you go, OS, it's not working. Let's go ahead and click the button and turn it back, revert it back to the previous state. Instead of having to rebuild and redeploy it, Netlify can just redeploy the old artifacts from the previous build. And then your dependencies here are actually cached for the next build. So all of the node modules for websites, for JavaScript websites rather, or projects, those are cached as well. So this way, when the next build happens, it doesn't have to re-download all of those from the NPM, the main NPM repository. And then finally, post-processing. This is very Netlify-specific stuff. So this particular website, which I've been showing the logs for, this is using Netlify Forms, which is just a service that Netlify uses to hook into your the post requests that come through, so they can take form data, store it in a nice clean table, so you can see it later down the line. So now let's look at what kind of tools we would need to build our own black box. And extra credit if anybody's a Futurama fan and understands that joke. If not, I'm not explaining it. Go look it up. The first tool is orchestration, the first category of tool, rather. So when I describe orchestration tools, I like to talk about them as kind of being the puppet master of the entire process. I started earlier in the talk by explaining that a lot of this whole DevOps process, there's automation involved. The orchestration is the puppet master that tells what scripts to fire when, what stuff should be pushed to where it's supposed to end up going. Next up, you still need somewhere to store your files. So websites at the end of the day are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the front end, maybe some backend code on the back end, but you still need somewhere to store that so people can access it. Content delivery network, we talked about that. You need a way to execute your serverless functions, so there needs to be a way to execute the backend code. Routing, you need, if you're going to be building and deploying multiple websites, which you can do if you build your own kinds of CI/CD pipelines, DevOps, you need a way to update your routing rules to say, if a request comes in and has this specific path, where should it go? Should it go to an API? Should it go to this website? Should it go to that website, that web application, etc.? Authentication. I'm going to take a drink, hold on. I include authentication for two reasons. One, Netlify has or had an identity service. I actually don't know if they do anymore. I think they recently might have deprecated it. But I like to recommend using authentication tools, tried and true authentication tools. I had contemplated taking this out of the presentation because now that I work for a third-party authentication provider, it kind of seems self-serving. But this is my second time giving this talk. I watched you record it, so I left authentication in last year when I didn't work for Clerk. I'm going to leave it in this time. It's kind of your choice. And then finally, infrastructure as code. This, if I had to say, is probably my favorite category of these tools, because infrastructure as code tools gives you a way to define your infrastructure that you want to deploy out to any endpoint in a single or multiple files, but doing it so in a declarative way. So typically, if you would go and configure something like AWS or GCP, you'd have to go into the console and click around to configure your services. IAC tools let you create configuration files and then let the service handle configuring that stuff the way it's supposed to using automation. And we're going to look at how all of these tools come together in my own project right now. So I said earlier that, is that zoomed in pretty good? Yeah, it's good. I said earlier that Destiny would become important, and now it becomes important. So before I get into my tool that I built, Guardian Forge is my application that I built and I now host. I need to explain how Destiny works. So there's lots of different activities in Destiny. Okay, it's a first-person shooter, but there's tons of different activities, and depending, especially with the harder activities, depending on what gear your character has on it, what armor and weapons and stuff, the game can be made significantly harder, significantly easier. So what a lot of people will do, myself included, not so much anymore, but what a lot of people will do is they'll go on YouTube or they'll go find a blog where these content creators will say, put a video up saying, hey, I'm going to recommend you use this character with all this equipment for this specific activity. Here's how you use it, so on and so forth. And I used to watch a lot of these when I was doing things around the house because my job is typically very mentally taxing. One of my guilty pleasures is washing dishes because I don't have to think about anything. So a lot of times I will put a video on in the background and kind of watch it. Well, the problem is as soon as I shut that laptop because I'm done washing dishes, all that information is gone out of my brain. So this idea came from my thought, wouldn't it be nice for there to be an easy way to just create a snapshot of it and share a web page so creators can put it inside of the description? And that's where the idea for Guardian Forge was born. So I can come in here into my profile, and I could select one of my characters, and this page will show all of the equipment that I currently have on this character in the game at this specific point in time. I can click on Create Build. Here we go. I can give my build a name. I can add some notes because these builds work a little bit differently depending on what activity you're in, what game you want it, what activity you're in, what kind of equipment you have on. And then I can select an activity here to basically tell the person who's receiving this what activity this build is good for. Now you'll notice there are two icons here that are very similar. There's Crucible and Competitive. These are PvP modes. This is where I like to thrive. But it kind of highlights the point of a single build can work across multiple different sub-activities inside of a single category. So what we're going to do as far as this demo is we're going to add another field here that lets me select a secondary activity. So I have a pull request already staged up here for the code. I'm going to come into Files Change just to demonstrate a little bit of what's going on here. The back end of Guardian Forge is all written in Go, and the front end is all written in JavaScript. So I use two separate languages. So this is the data model that gets stored long-term inside of AWS, which is where this is all hosted. Here is the build meta panel, which was that top field that shows you where you can select between the different activities. So we're adding a secondary activity as far as the props here. And then a lot of the rest of the code here is just adding that field in there. And then there's a lot of nested components inside of this application. So a lot of this is just prop drilling. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this code is going to add that field. So I'm going to come back into my conversation here. And because I did an extremely thorough pull request review with all you lovely people here, we're going to go ahead and click Merge Pull Request. And I will click Confirm Merge. So once I can merge this in, the branch has been updated. My QA branch, which is where I'm merging into, has been updated. And I have a series of GitHub actions that will kick off based on this process. And what these GitHub actions will do is simulate a very similar workflow, just like Netlify will pull when you make changes to a branch to deploy it out. So I can come in each one of these. There's two of them, one for deploy the app, which is the front end, and then one for deploy the back end. We're going to start with the app because that one's going to go a little bit quicker just based on the nature of it. And we can look at these different steps here and kind of line them up a little bit close to, kind of match and compare between what we have in Netlify. So setup job is the first part of this job, and this is setting up a container inside of GitHub's infrastructure in order for this entire build to happen. Extract branch name is pulling out the name of the branch. This is just a bash script that's being executed inside of the workflow. Checkout is where the code from the repository inside of GitHub is going to be cloned inside of the container. I have a shared library that is used across 3 separate front-end applications that actually power Guardian Forge. That is a discussion we can have afterwards, but it's not really pertinent to this talk. I have a step here to transform configurations, which lets me support multiple environments using these workflows. Netlify has something very similar, even though I didn't show it in the logs. They have an environments feature where you can swap in and out different secrets and environment variables in order to drive the different branch deployments. Hold on, we're getting ahead of myself here. Clone some of this up, or close some of this up. It's getting really ahead of me here. Okay, so the next step is my npm install build, which is relatively self-explanatory. We're going to install our dependencies and build it. Clean deploy directory, this is all hosted, again, inside of AWS, specifically in an S3 bucket. For those of you not familiar, S3 is just blob storage up in AWS, files and folders. So I'm wiping out the old artifacts from that directory. I'm going to copy the new artifacts into that directory, and then I'm going to invalidate the cache. I use CloudFront as a CDN. It's just AWS's flavor of a CDN, so I'm going to wipe out those cached objects. A little bit different than what Netlify does, where it would push the updated files into their CDN. I instead wipe it out. So the first person who accesses those files might have a little bit slower of a connection, but the second that cache is populated, everyone else in that geographical region will be able to access those files relatively quick as well. And then there's post-checkout and cleanup where everything is torn down. So that is deploying the front end. Now, one of the interesting things, because I can control this myself, I like working in a mono repo. So I can deploy the backend completely separately from the front end. If you will see a little bit in a moment then when we look at the action workflow files, how I can differentiate between these two and when each one of these deploys should happen. But we're going to work through a lot of very similar steps for the backend. We're setting up the job, extracting the branch name, checking out the code. This right here, this setup SAM, this is a pre-built GitHub action that AWS hosts to install the SAM CLI. I use AWS SAM for my infrastructure as code tool, which lets me push out and configure all of my infrastructure into AWS without having to manually do it, which is critical to this entire demo here. SAM version is a debug thing that should not have been left in there, but here we are. Write default params. Both of these steps are very similar to the previous, where we're setting up the environment with its correct environment variables, so this way it can work in QA versus production. And then build and deploy is probably one of the most interesting steps of this entire process. So what I'm going to do here is call AWS SAM deploy. I think it's deploy if I remember off the top of my head. And what this is going to do is it's going to take all of the code that powers the backend functions as well as the infrastructure, create the artifacts, and then push and configure everything out in AWS. This is the step where that actually happens. So we're going to let this finish before we circle back and take a look at the updated version of the application. Let's step through real quickly here the two different GitHub actions that we just walked through. So this is the definition for my GitHub action workflow that deploys the front end. This right here, this on section here, these are the triggers. So inside of Netlify, the trigger is typically your code's change in Git, deploy. That's it. GitHub Actions, because I'm using my own custom tooling, I have a little more fine-grained control over that. So I have workflow dispatch, which lets me deploy it manually. So for some reason, some part of my process breaks, I have a button inside of GitHub Actions where I can click and deploy it manually. But then this section here says, I want to deploy anytime there's a change made to the QA branch, specifically inside of the front end /public/whatever folder, basically indicating that some part of my front end code has changed and only the front end needs to be pushed out. We don't need to worry about the back end. I'm using the AWS CLI pretty heavily inside of here to do some things. So I'm setting up my access key ID and secret key, which is basically like a systematic username and password for AWS, more or less. And then here is where the actual steps for the job take place. So we're going to step through a couple of these here. In deploy app, that's just the name of the job. Environment is, as I had mentioned earlier, we can swap in and out configuration files. GitHub Actions is a very similar feature where you can specify configuration files based on the environment name. This is actually running a script which is going to extract the branch name, which we had mentioned earlier was kind of important for this whole process. Runs on Ubuntu latest. So this is the container. I'm running on Ubuntu. However, if I needed to craft builds that needed Windows for whatever reason, I could swap this out and use a Windows container, or I could swap it out and use a Mac container. Netlify, this is where the comparisons kind of break down, because most websites can just be built in a Linux machine. But if you were building something like a Mac app, for instance, you can only do that using a Mac container. So this is where you would do that. Not quite sure it's a container in the back end, but that's neither here nor there. And then each one of my steps here is kind of defined individually that matches one for what we saw inside of the GitHub Actions execution. So extract branch name. This is going to actually run a bash script which pulls out from the context that's being executed. It's going to pull the branch name out of there, and it's going to place that inside of a variable that I can use later down in this execution. Here's my checkout. This is actually using a pre-configure actions as well, although this is, if you look at any GitHub actions, this specific step is very standard because this basically says use the code that's inside of the current repository. I'm running another bash script here to set up that shared library. I have a custom Go script which is going to swap out those configuration variables. I have another step here that's going to build the front end, and then for the rest of this, the clean deploy directory, the copy to S3, and the invalidate cache, I'm actually using the AWS CLI directly inside of here and just essentially executing scripts. So there's nothing that I've imported from the GitHub Actions Marketplace in here. If you're not familiar, the GitHub Actions Marketplace is a public place you can go to find GitHub Actions that other people have created that you can import inside of your library, or inside of your workflow rather. Here's the back end. A lot of this is going to be very similar in here. And when I push to the QA branch, I'm not worried about the front end, I'm worried about the back end. So if any code changes to the back end, this will execute. I'm setting up my AWS secrets here. Here's a container, extract the branch name, checkout. This is that step that I had mentioned earlier that's setting up the SAM CLI that's provided by AWS. We're also transforming our configurations here. I have another step here because it needed to be set up in a very specific way for my application because I like to overcomplicate things. And then finally, here is where the SAM CLI is actually being executed. I have the specific command being buried inside of a make file, but it essentially is calling SAM deploy and then passing all those environment parameters in. So when AWS SAM runs, what it's going to do is it's going to reference this massive YAML file. If you can see, there's 881 lines of code on here. And each one of these different sections kind of does something different. I'm not going to run through the whole thing because I could probably talk for about 2 hours as far as what everything in here does, but I want to call some specific things out. So the first thing I want to call out is I have a parameter section. Just like you would pass parameters into a function, AWS SAM lets you pass in parameters to an execution. And this is how I can support multiple environments or reconfiguring the infrastructure in a specific way. And then what one of these resources look like inside of the resources section, this will map to configurations inside of AWS. So picking a very simple one, this site bucket here, this is the actual S3 bucket that will store all of the artifacts that are built from the front end of the website. Specifically, here's the type here. So it's basically saying the site bucket resource is going to be a type of AWS S3 bucket. See, even in the one down here, I'm calling something completely different. Here's my CloudFront distribution. And then we're going to pass in a bucket name here. This is kind of the name of the container that's going to be stored. So I'm leveraging the environments param that's being passed in here in order to spin up a fresh bucket if for whatever reason I want to spin up a new environment to support something unique that I'm doing in a branch. S3 supports hosting public files. Otherwise, I wouldn't be putting it here. So I have some ACL rules basically saying, hey, open the doors, let people come and access the files when they request them. And then there's some additional website configuration. So this is just one of the more simple resources I have defined here. But if I scroll down here, you can see there are tons of different things like Lambda functions, and there's database stuff in here, there's API stuff in here. And at the end of the day, all of this is going to get compiled into something called CloudFormation, which is going to be shown here. And when one of these guys run, this is going to spin up all the resources. This is basically going to cross-reference what AWS looks like now and what I want it to look like and make them match. So now that that is all run, if I come into Guardian Forge again, let's just go ahead and refresh this page. Load. We now have a secondary activity icon here. So I can pick between two different activities if a build matches multiple activities. The main take home is this entire thing was executed and run and deployed without me actually having to go in and click around to deploy stuff. If anyone's been in the field long enough, you'll know that in the old days we used to basically build and compile stuff on our computer and FTP drag and drop and hope for the best. This saves all that trouble. So now comes the fun part, at least for me, for this demo. So the updated version of this talk, this is the second time I've given this talk at that. I was here last year. I updated these workflows in order to support branch-based deployments just like you would expect inside of Netlify. So we're going to do some audience interaction here. Somebody give me a branch name. Give me a branch name. Shashi? I like it. Let's deploy Shashi. All right, so I'm going to create a new branch. And I have another workflow here configured that essentially merges the two together for the initial creation of the branch so they can be run sequentially as opposed to separately, which is required. But if I come to actions, because I created that branch, I now am calling the deploy stack workflow. And as I said, all y'all start praying. We're going to go back to slides and hope this works out for the best. All right, so now let's go through the infrastructure and how this whole thing kind of works to give a better visual representation of the different categories of tools that I described earlier, what I'm using to make this happen, and kind of how they all fit together to make this whole process possible. So the first one I'm using is GitHub Actions. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. What's up? YAML in general, or that one specifically? That is for AWS SAM. So AWS SAM, just to clarify, CloudFormation is AWS's service that allows you to define infrastructure as code, and they will handle the heavy lifting of deploying everything out. I chose to go with AWS SAM, which technically when you deploy it, converts it to CloudFormation, and then AWS deploys it, because AWS SAM, as part of the CLI, lets you run it all locally, so I could spin it up and test it before deploying it. Makes things easier. Sure. So orchestration, GitHub Actions. So when one of those actions runs, the workflows run, essentially AWS SAM is going to run, and it's going to deploy all this infrastructure out into AWS that basically supports Guardian Forge. AWS SAM, as I mentioned, is my infrastructure as code tool, and I just really like working with AWS SAM. The IEC was so cool. I get fascinated by it. But let's step through this. So the next thing I have is file storage for hosting. I mentioned AWS S3. I actually have two buckets, one for data and one for the actual site itself. So all of my files are hosted and stored in S3. CloudFront's the CDN, Content Delivery Network. That is, we've kind of talked about that several times. Routing. This is where I'm including CloudFront in here because it actually does a little bit of routing too. So I use Route 53 inside of AWS for DNS registrations. So as new environments are spun up, the theory is that if I pass in the name of the branch, it's going to hook into Route 53 and say, I want to register Shashi with Route 53 now. And then the next thing is, depending on if it's API-Shashi or shashi.guardianforge.net, it's either going to go to CloudFront on top, and then CloudFront will route between one of those three separate front-end applications that I described earlier, depending on the path that comes in. Or on the bottom there is API Gateway, which will then route the API request off to a series of Lambda functions. Lambda is just it's a serverless environment to execute code up in AWS. I actually have a ton of them. I have like 20 to 30 Lambda functions because when I was first building Guardian Forge, I wanted to make sure I was following best practices, and I went down a rabbit hole studying best practices according to AWS. So came across a video that said you should have an individual Lambda function, not just for every single path or endpoint, but you should also have an individual function for every HTTP action. So I have like 3 to 4 functions per single thing. Definitely would not recommend it. It kind of creates a management nightmare if you're doing this yourself, but yes, sir. Correct. Yes. Thank you for clarifying. That was a good question. For authentication, I know I mentioned using a third-party service. I'm actually just using Bungie's authentication. Bungie is the manufacturer of, or the developer of Destiny. I figured if somebody is logging into my website, they have to A, be a player, and B, have an account on Bungie's website for this whole thing to work. So I just hook directly into their auth system. You will notice inside of AWS there are two other services that I have. There are 2 other services that I have not mentioned here. The first one is DynamoDB. DynamoDB is a NoSQL database that is available through AWS, and I can configure things such as the indexes and the name of the table directly within AWS SAM for it to deploy. And then also the next one is SQS, which is a queuing service. For those of you not familiar with how queuing works, it can get really deep on a technical level, but in a nutshell, with the queuing service, you have 2 applications at least. You have an application on the left, you have an application on the right. Swap those depending on how you're looking at me. And then you have a queue in between. Application A drops a message onto the queue, JSON, text, whatever. Application B picks it up, does something with it. That's queuing in a nutshell. AWS supports SQS. I think it's one of their oldest services, actually. So I'm using this to do some pretty cool asynchronous processing of the build data that comes in. So in order to explain better how that works, we're going to walk through the process of what creating a build in Guardian Forge looks like from a system standpoint. User submits the build. It's JSON payload, comes in, checks Route 53 just to make sure it can resolve the DNS properly. It's going to resolve to API Gateway, where that JSON payload is going to be sent to. And then API Gateway is going to in turn pass that along to my Lambda function that accepts the build to create it. Now, when a build is created, there are 5 things that actually happen. However, only the first 2 of those 5 steps are required in order for my application to respond to the user to say your build's good to go. So the first thing that happens is it stores the raw JSON for the build inside of an S3 bucket. I do this for cost storage or cost saving measures because storage in S3 is cheaper than storage in DynamoDB. So I can save the entire document inside of S3, and then next up I can save a summary for things like search or indexing or bookmarking inside of DynamoDB, where they can actually be searched through. Once those 2 things happen, the next thing that happens is that Lambda will drop a message on the queue, and then it responds to the user and says, hey, you're good to go. You can share this. You can do whatever you want with the build afterwards. However, I said there are 5 things. We only covered 2. The next thing that happens is another Lambda function, actually it might be a couple, picks it up and does the additional 3 things. The first thing is I wanted Guardian Forge to have an excellent sharing experience. So I wanted to create a custom Open Graph image as opposed to using a generic one. So that Lambda function will create an Open Graph image and store it with the build data inside of S3. So if somebody shares it, Twitter will come pick it back up. It's still called Twitter. I agree with that. I can't remember who said it. Twitter will pick it up and use that instead of a default image. The next thing that happens is it will send that message off to Algolia, which I use to power search on the website. So when somebody goes in there and they search for it, the payload is transformed a little bit so Algolia can understand it, and then that build is now available for search. But if you think about it, in order for a build to be shareable, it doesn't quite need to be searchable. So if this process is deferred a little bit, no big deal. And because I like the dopamine hit of people actually using my application, I send myself a little Discord notification because I like knowing people actually use the things that I build. Okay. So we're going to go back to the old icon design here because I needed to switch it to make sense for that. So creating a new environment, in this case we created Shashi, we have a branch name. I extracted that branch name inside of the GitHub Actions workflow, and I can pass it in AWS SAM as a parameter for the execution. So when AWS SAM runs with that branch, we get a whole new environment created. I get fresh copies of all my database. I get fresh S3 buckets. I get new Lambda functions that are all named appropriately. So this way, once I'm testing and debugging things, I can go into CloudWatch. AWS has too many services. I go into CloudWatch in order to look through the logs and sift through and find out why something's going wrong, right? It's all named really well, so this way I can go through and find stuff. All that is made possible by AWS SAM and parameters and GitHub Actions. So now for the real question. You've been 33 minutes. You guys have been all sitting here talking to me or listening to me talk about why all this stuff is cool, but why the hell would any of you want to do any of this when you can just commit something to GitHub and Netlify deploys it? When I first submitted, move that out of the way. When I first submitted this talk, I had 2 key takeaways, but when I actually created a talk, I had 4 takeaways because they're all important. The first one is the more skills you have, the more opportunities you have. We all know that layoffs are kind of prevalent in this world. I myself was actually a victim of one earlier this year. It's not a fun place to be. So let's imagine who's gone out and looked for resume templates in here. Anybody? Sure, most people have. You see the cute ones that say little gauges of how much percentage of a specific type. No one knows what the hell that means, but they're all there, right? So let's actually use that for a moment. So let's say you're caught up in a layoff wave of 10,000 people as part of your company. You're now competing with 9,999 other people now newly active in application pools in order to simply put food on your table. One of your former coworkers comes along and says, I have 95% React, whatever that means, and you have 80% React. He clearly outshines you in React. They clearly outshine you in React. But let's say, they can make your website half a millisecond faster. But let's say you know how to do all this stuff, or at least have a ballpark idea of how to do all this stuff. You will likely be more valuable to a company by having a wider skill set than going deep. I definitely recommend going deep on topics, but you should also go wide and learn how this kind of stuff works. Next up, there's more services that you can use. I won't beat this one to death. You saw how I was able to defer some of the processing of a build in Guardian Forge to make my user experience a little bit faster. I wouldn't be able to do this with Netlify because these services aren't offered for Netlify. I'm a big believer in fundamental knowledge on topics. So I now work for Clerk, which is a user management platform. As part of that, there's third-party auth rolled into that, right? It's kind of one of the big things that they do very well, I will say. Now, one of the other parts of my job is to go on Twitter and look at people and find out who's having trouble with the product, who has questions. And one of the things that has been brought to my attention is how many people have this innate desire to tell people not to use third-party auth and to build their own. And then there's counter-argument of people who tell you to use third-party auth and not really your own. You should know how to build auth. I think there's this idea that these companies that build these services don't want you to know this stuff. The knowledge is out there. And I think everybody should know how to build these systems, whether it's auth or building some kind of DevOps system in order to do it, because knowing how this stuff works will make you better at debugging when things break. Because if for some reason something, like Netlify is going to go down, like there's going to be issues, right? If you know where that process is, maybe Netlify is a bad example because they kind of hold the keys to the kingdom, but if you know where there's a potential weak link in the chain, you can look at that and say, oh, this is where it is. Let's go fix that. Total aside story. Many years ago when I was in my systems and networking day, we had a site go down. Our second data center was at our second biggest warehouse in the country. It's offline, which is interesting because we pay AT&T a lot of money to make sure that doesn't happen, including backup internet and routing rules and stuff. Well, back at that time, I was studying how to become a Cisco certified thingamajigger, whatever they're called these days. So I understood, because I was studying at the time, how routing protocols worked, how routers talk to each other and figure out who wins and where the traffic should go, right? So this should be solved, right? So I call AT&T and they're like, hey, what's going on? And they go, oh yeah, we have one of our points is up, but it's like, little ways up the chain between the hops that go between your warehouses. And I'm like, okay, so if that's the case, I kind of assumed their router, and I assumed their router was configured away because they don't let you touch anything. And AT&T works at AT&T pace. They really don't prioritize unless they absolutely need to. I theoretically was like, okay, so if this is out and this is why it's out, hey John, do me a favor, go over to the network closet, move this cable from here to here, and boom, everything comes back up. And everyone's like, oh, how'd you do that? Warehouse workers are like, yay, we can work again. Well, they probably weren't excited, but everybody thought I was cool that day. But by knowing how things work, my point is you could be the hero of your own story at some point, which is it's a good feeling. And if everything I've said has not convinced you to go down the path of learning how this stuff works, I think that's okay too. Like, at least now knowing all of the things that go on behind the covers, you can appreciate these services more. Like, I just showed you this monstrosity of a thing that I deployed out, and I have not done this since. It's been 4 years, and I have not done anything like this since. I still use Netlify to this day. I use Vercel. I use Fly. They're some of my favorite services to use because they just make this stuff so easy. So, at least you can appreciate what we're given these days. But now, on the other side of that, let's say you've seen me talk about all this, and now you're like, hey, I'm excited to do this. I want to see how to do it. I want to get going, right? There's a couple tips and key takeaways that I want to finish off with. So the first one is to start small and grow. Again, what I built is fairly complicated and massive, and definitely you do not need to go to that level first. If you are working with Netlify, they offer a CLI that you can use to deploy stuff out to Netlify using GitHub Actions. That is a great first step, just to kind of get your feet wet in GitHub Actions and learn how to work with the CLIs. Next up, I recommend knowing your ecosystem. And when I say know your ecosystem, I really mean when you run npm run build or npm build, you should know where those artifacts end up. And that's not going to be the same depending on what framework you're using. It's going to be different for a React app. It's going to be different for a Next app. It's going to be different for a Remix app, which is funny because they're all React, but they're all different. So in the extreme different example, Go is completely different. I showed you that I'm using Go for the backend functions here. Go will compile everything to a single binary. So it's not creating a bunch of files you can execute. I worked in .NET for a long time. That does not work anything like either one of those systems. So knowing how your ecosystem creates artifacts and knowing how to construct these things and how to, going back to the example of FTPing from your computer onto a server, knowing how that process works is going to help you understand how to use automation and scripts in order to make this stuff happen automatically. And then it leads to my last point, learn how to automate. Because if you notice in my workflows, most of that is just bash scripts that are executing. I love GitHub Actions Marketplace. I love that a lot of this is kind of taken care of for us by other developers. But I don't want to say impossible because somebody has told me there is a way to do it. But running a GitHub action on my computer as part of a workflow, it might be kind of challenging. I can execute bash. So learn how to bash, learn how to use CLIs, learn how to use PowerShell, you learn how to use whatever shell you want. If at first you don't succeed, that's right. Mom's and dad taught us when we were little, you fall off a bike, you get back up, right? Building a DevOps pipeline takes this a lot further. You're not going to get this the first time. You're probably not going to get it the second. You might not get it the 100th time. When I was updating this talk and I added some of the branch deployment stuff in there, that was like a solid day's worth of work, just like trial and erroring things and waiting to get from point A to point B. I theoretically in my mind knew how to do it, but trying to put the rubber to the road and make it actually happen is a challenge. And when you're working in these types of environments, there is a lot of like, change something, push it, start praying. Change something, push it, start praying, and just find out what happens. And then you find a weak link, you fix that, and then you iterate on it and build it over and over again. That's normal, is my whole point of that slide. And also, there is no one right way to do it. There is no straight path on this. If you pick up a DevOps book, because again, you're all excited after leaving my talk. You pick up a DevOps book and you start reading it, and there are 8 distinct phases of DevOps, and you should do this for step 1 and this for phase 2. And that stuff is all great, but it's kind of like a North Star you could potentially get to. I've worked in several organizations where I've either helped build these pipelines or they were implemented before I even joined, and not a single one of them followed the 8 distinct phases of how DevOps is supposed to be done. So generally what I like to recommend to people is the whole point of this is to prevent issues where you are FTPing from point A to point B and you might miss a file and break it. As long as you can deploy consistently from one spot to the next, it's a really good place to be. Things might change. I mean, to be honest, AWS changed a bunch in the way that they deploy stuff by the time I came along to update this talk, which is why it took me a whole day to fix it because I had to figure out a new way to deploy. But yeah, so as long as you can get from point A to point B, the automation hopefully will take care of the rest of that. And then finally, build something yourself. So on screen are a list of a bunch of different icons. I work in developer marketing, and developer marketers love their logos. So there's a bunch of logos for you. There's also a QR code there, because I don't expect everybody to know exactly what all of these logos are and what they do. There's a QR code there that goes to my website, or if you're averse to scanning things with your phone, there's the direct URL. That will take you to a page on my website which breaks down all the categories of tools that I explained in this talk, along with recommendations. They're basically links to the websites for a lot of these tools, broken down to make it easier for you to kind of like pick and choose and throw something together yourself. And now, let's see if this demo worked. All right, so my deploy stack is finished. So now, theoretically, I can go to https://shashi. I'm so glad this is making it into my recording, by the way. Thank you for that. Guardian Forge R53. I'm using R53 because the actual Guardian Forge domain is hosted somewhere else, but I hit enter. We have the Shashi environment. So, thank you. You're breathtaking. Thank you for hanging out with me for 45 minutes and nerding out about this stuff. That's my contact information. That link on the bottom is to a Linktree-esque website. So if you want to just hit me up on whatever social you want, I'd love to connect. I like to nerd out about this stuff. Thank you.